So before I start to ask questions of Gareth, I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro, and we were laughing a little bit about his bio. So I'm going to read it to you and you'll understand why we're laughing. Gareth Conner is the president of Creative Conners and the author of the Scenic Automation Handbook, which if you haven't read, you should read because it's a fantastic book on automation. He's been in the business of making scenery move for more than 25 years, but theatrical automation hasn't always been his passion. At age 3, after loving encouragement from his parents to be anything he wanted when he grew up, he decided he wanted to be a whale because whales are really neat. But by age 5, he'd recovered from that obvious disappointment because humans can't become whales, of course, and asked for a set of real tools for Christmas. He received plastic toy tools, and so he was inspired after that. Eventually, Gareth did get his hands on some real tools, dove into theatre, and got hooked on theatrical and automation. Years later, Gareth found himself equipped with the experience of automating scenery using a wide range of mechanical and electronic techniques, some of which are better left forgotten. Well, we better talk about those ones. On budget raising from dozens to millions of dollars, he grew convinced he could create a system of automation components that would reduce the cost and complexity of scenic automation. That conviction was the inspiration for Creative Conners, Inc., and is the most fun he's ever had, even better than being a whale. Thank you, Gareth, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This is going to be great.
I totally love the story of wanting to be a whale.
Yeah, it was definitely a disappointing moment. And I think my parents were a little chagrined to realize that their son was quite that daft to think that he could have been a whale. But
could be metamorphosis into a whale.
Anything should be possible.
Exactly. So the reason we asked you to come on Theatre Out Life is because a lot of the discussion that we've talked about with regards to automation has been in circus automation and flying people. And yet a lot of the questions that we've had from some of our webinar attendees and registered people is been about theatrical automation and just a little bit more of the foundation. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And also just to talk to you about how automation can be used, why we should consider automation, what are the creative opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get started with some of your thoughts on, how we get started and why.
Yeah, no, I think I honestly think that's the best first question to ask, before we talk about the how do we do automation, which will be a topic for next week's webinar. But to address the why do we use automation, I think that automation has a somewhat undeserved reputation as being finicky and expensive and complicated. And there's a little bit of truth, I suppose, to some of that. It requires a bit more planning and forethought than just sticking a rope on something and pulling a piece of scenery around. But I think there's a lot of what gets missed in those conversations as we're talking about technical details and finances is what's the real creative value that you gain from automation, and what doors does it open to the creative vision of a set designer to incorporate automation into a show, just like you would use color or you use geometry and shape, or you use light. Like, how can motion be used as part of the creative expression? And so I always say, I run an automation company, so I always say everything should be automated. And I think that's mostly true. And although I will, one of the reasons why I'm not in sales as part of my business is that I will honestly say that there are times when maybe just sticking a rope on it or just having a person push a wagon makes more sense. But we're going to ignore all of those situations for today and only talk about the times where automation is providing value to the production. And I have kind of 4 main reasons that I think automation should be employed. And what I'd like to do today is talk about those 4. And we'll just outline those at the beginning. And then I've got some video clips that will demonstrate some good use cases that support that premise for each of those 4 things. So the first one, I've got my little cheat sheet down low, so you can see me glancing down here. But my first one is repeatable motion. And that's, I like to say, is the kind of plain yogurt reason why we use automation. So it's maybe not the most interesting thing, but it's good for you. And that's where we just want the audience to experience the same show every night. And this is why we rehearse, right? Where if you have a tricky scene change and you would do it without automation, you would have your stagehands rehearse the motions so that this audience is getting the same experience night after night. And I think that that's even better achieved with automation than rehearsing stagehands. I think the next one are kind of two sides of the same coin, so I lump them together, but they're either that you want to move something faster than is practical by hand, or you have something that's heavier than is practical to move by hand. And we'll probably touch on this at several points, but I do make the distinction here between automating versus just mechanizing. Because of course, if you want something to move fast or you have to push a real heavy load, you could also just mechanize it, meaning like take a motor and stick it on there. And I think the best example of this would be like a chain hoist, right? I mean, most people are very familiar with chain hoists, but your most familiar control is just like a push button. So you like hold down the button and the thing moves or lifts, and you let go of the button when it's in place. And that's not automation. That's just mechanization. And where automation really shines when you have something fast or something heavy is that you've got to move really quickly, but also hit your spot dead. And so I think that's a great use of automation. And then where I think it starts to get more interesting, both technically and artistically, is when you really start thinking of your set changes as choreography. That these are not just moving something heavy, moving something fast, moving something to the same spot every night at the same time, where the motion is visually pleasing, or it advances the story even better than you can do without it. Sometimes I get asked, like, what's your favorite automation that you've ever done? And not very often. Most people try to get me to shut up about talking about automation. But when I get somebody to throw me that softball, one of my favorite shows to remember is a production that we helped with at the McCarter Theater in New Jersey in the U.S. And it was a very simple show. It was a one-man show, but it was one man and a chair. And the chair was on an automated rig. And so the chair actually became the second character in the show. And without automation, that would have been a very boring production, right? Because this chair was almost like in a cartoon sense, it was the other person in the show. And I think that sort of creativity and intricate motion is really neat. We won't see the chair today, but we'll see some other examples of intricate scene changes and motions that would be very difficult to do either by hand or just in a mechanized fashion with push buttons and dials. And then the last thing that we'll dig into is where I think that we're seeing the most explosion of creative use of automation, and that's in integrating automation with other systems in the show. So predominantly, the big one, of course, being projection. Projection is becoming huge. That's a great tool for scene designers these days. And being able to project images onto physical 3D objects and have those projections stay with the 3D object, map onto it, is a big use. We also see the same thing with lighting. How many times do you have something that's sliding on stage for the street scene, and you want that light cue to hit just when the bench lands, right, for the park scene or whatever. And of course, as a phenomenal stage manager yourself, the art of calling those cues. But you can also, these things are now all talking on the same information network. And the automation computer can just send a quick message over to the lighting console to make sure that it happens every night on the same spot. And if there's any snag, any reason why something got delayed, a little hiccup in the track, whatever, it's when we hit that position, we're going to trigger the lighting cue. And that coordination across systems, I think, is really exciting. And I think we're only just kind of at the tip of the iceberg there. I think, as we were discussing before we started, I think that automation has for so long been kind of relegated to the technical director's purview, which is certainly, it's a technical aspect to the show, and obviously we need technicians to be greatly involved in it. But I think as scenic designers across the spectrum in live performance think more about motion and design with motion in mind, we're getting really exciting things to work on as technical people. So
yeah, well, it opens up so many more doors, really, when you're thinking from a design perspective about what's possible for a staging design or lighting design and projection, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as we were joking about prior to, it's like when somebody asks me like, what's the coolest thing you could do with automation, I think like, oh God, please don't ask me that question. I have no idea what the it's ironic because our name's Creative Conners for the company, but our creative energies are really on the engineering side of like, how do we get this done, not what does it look like. We rely on the designers to come up with that visual, and then we want to help execute it. And so I think as that's becoming kind of part and parcel of scenic design, we're getting some really interesting things. And similarly, I mean, it's, and projection designers and lighting designers, we're morphing these things together as they interrelate more. So
yeah, super exciting.
Yeah. So with that said, that's kind of the outline of where we're going today. And I think we'll get started looking at one of these videos, and I'll just set up these videos as we do them. But this first one, this is from a few years back, but we did a couple of hydraulic scissor lifts for Eminem and Rihanna. They were out on the Monster tour a few years back, and they had 3 lifts. So you had kind of center stage and one left, one right. And they were double stacked hydraulic scissor lifts because they needed to be able to punch up above the stage and then dip down below the stage to let the performers on or off. And traditionally, the production company would have done this with manual valves. And so these are hydraulic scissor lifts, and they would usually just run them manually. But with 3 of them that had to be coordinated, and with some demands from the design team that they really wanted some of these motions to reliably hit at various points in the musical performance, the production company's like, then it really needs to be automated. Now we can't just mechanize it and run it with like manual valves. We need to get a computer involved so we can control the scene. So
you're saying that musically they wanted to hit points at certain times?
They did.
Yeah,
they did. And I would say that, I think that their requirements are probably a little looser than most theatrical ones because, rock and roll is just kind of big spectacle, a lot of smoke, a lot of lights. But it's like as the music is fading out, we really want the lift to be just going beneath the stage. And they want that just to be night after night. Obviously, right? This is going to go on a truck. It's going to go stadium to stadium to stadium. And everybody who buys their exorbitantly expensive ticket wants to get the same experience, and so automation is key for this. And so let's go ahead and play this one.
Yeah, let's take a look.
And so this first shot here is just of wash, rinse, repeat, right? So same thing every night. There's a shot of the end result. This is a shop test. So you see here we got a couple of scissor lifts with a test weight on top. And the automation operator here is just checking them out and running the lifts. And then here's a backstage shot as we're through all that rock and roll haze. If you kind of eye up the center there, you can see Rihanna's kneeling, and there's a guitarist behind her. And this is kind of the end of the song, big finish. And as everything starts to fade out, there she is hitting stage level and then descending below. And again, I think that this is not the most exciting use of automation, but just because it's not exciting doesn't make it valuable, right? This is adding value to that performance because they can get that same reliable, repeatable marks night after night after night.
And out of interest with that scene, obviously they have the infrastructure. So is there an automation guy touring with that set piece, and is there more? How many people are going with that automated system basically on the tour?
That's a good question. Right. Yes. So there was an automation operator that's actually running those cues and triggering the motions there. So there's one automation operator who's kind of on stage, over stage right in the wings, and then you're touring also with two hydraulic mechanics who are basically just tending the hydraulics downstairs in the basement, or not really basement, but the temporary basement set up by the stage overhead. So in that case, you're doing it with 3 technicians. But normally what they would have done prior is they had 2 lifts, as you could see there, right? So stacked scissor lifts to be able to get the height, and they would have needed a manual valve operator for each lift. So previously they would have done it with 6 people. And this first example is moving something that is a bit faster than you would do normally by hand. And so this is actually a kinetic sculpture. This was a 250-pound mannequin, and the idea was that they made like a cube of truss, and this mannequin needed to be able to be positioned anywhere in that cube. But where we get tricky is that there's large chains connected to the head and a wrist and an ankle on the mannequin, and the chains need to move at 144 inches a second. So it's like 4 meters-ish a second. And it's not quite a free fall look. I mean, it's not quite a free fall in reality, but they want this free fall look. So they need a dichotomy between creeping up super slow and then crashing down to the ground. So the point of this exhibit was a young man's struggles in life and him kind of being beaten around by the world. And so there was a lot of like getting raised up high and then literally like dropping to the ground and smashing appearing to smash into the ground. The head of the mannequin had an awful lot of electronics in it, because one of the things that the mannequin was capable of doing is they had eyes that were glass, and they had fiber optics adhered to the glass, and then behind that were little LCD screens, and they had a Kinect sensor that would find humans in the surrounding gallery, and the eyes would display a video that had the pupils move so that it looked as though the eyes were tracking you as you walked around, which was a little creepy to say the least, but a lot of fancy electronics in the head. And so we want it to look like it's dropping to the ground, but it can't really sustain that sort of impact. So this is the sort of thing that, like, if you were going to do this with a rope, you're automatically in a bit of a quandary, because it's a 250-pound mannequin. So that's a lot. You need a few people on it, or a lot of mechanical advantage. And then to be able to go from very, very slow to very, very fast and hit a mark that makes it look like you're hitting the ground, but not quite hitting the ground, is a challenge. So a couple of things that we'll see in the video. We'll see. We can go ahead and we can start it. I'll just. Before
you do it, can I ask a question? In what context was this? Was this like a theater show, or was this a concert?
Good question. Yeah, so this was actually a kinetic sculpture. So this was an art installation. So there was an artist who had come up with this concept and made some models and so on, but then hired a team of people to produce it. So it first exhibited it in New York, and then in Amsterdam and a few other places, I think London as well.
Okay. Cool.
So yeah, art installation. Yeah.
All right, let's take a look.
So not your traditional theater, but. So Speedy Delivery, this is the fast stuff. So this is the overview shot of what that truss and mannequin looked like. That's yours truly with the mannequin. And this is a shop test, and you can see how fast that chain is whizzing through that hoist, and then yet it still stops, dead. And this is a slow-mo of it, just so you can see that kind of crazy helix that's being created as the chain's getting sucked out of the chain bag. You figure that 144 inches a second is crazy fast. I mean, the chain actually is moving so fast that the momentum of it peels it off of the chain wheel. So here it is creeping up, and there's a sacrificial pallet on the ground that we're using just to see if we actually, if we miss our mark and smash the pallet with a 250-pound weight, and it'll release to make the simulated drop. And there you can see a little decel, and it saves the pallet from demise. So that's the sort of thing that I think, that's kind of speed and control of a piece is where, again, automation really shines. That, doing that by hand or on a pickle. Like if you imagine 144 inches a second with a push button, and you're trying to eye up like, I'm about to hit the ground, that only happens in a second. So pretty tough to do.
No, interesting. And that was a touring installation. You said it went to a number of locations, right?
Yeah, that's right. So that was, again, a touring installation, and not really shown in there, but those are those chain hoists were probably the most interesting part of it, that these custom chain hoists that have to move at high speed, giant chain. And the chain was only so giant just for the artistic look. There was no mechanical need for it to be that way. But then each of those chain hoists was actually on a tracking trolley that was also automated. So if you can imagine that there's those 3 chains that are connecting to 3 different parts of that mannequin, by pulling on the chains, we can kind of move that mannequin throughout the cube. Yeah. And then each of those chain hoists could also slide back and forth to give us even more versatility in how it worked. And then, just as a jumping ahead a little bit, but the other interesting thing about that installation was that we had to be able to fire off messages to other systems in the art installation about when that mannequin was at certain places, so that we knew exactly where it was, and then we could send off a sound trigger or a light trigger as well.
Right.
Which is pretty cool. Super
cool.
And then for this next one, so that's moving super fast. And then here's a setup where we're just moving something very heavy. And obviously heavy you could also do with a mechanized system, but once again, it's not just heavy, it's like heavy and precise. So we have some really big archways that are sliding back and forth and have to mate up and look continuous once they're sucked together. And this is a traditional theater show. This is at the Old Globe out in San Diego for one of their productions, and it's a beautiful piece of scenery. There's multiple layers to it, and we can go ahead and run it. And you'll see here, there's many layers going back on the scenery and making these giant archways, and they're all moving at the same time, and they have to seam up and look seamless by the time they connect. And we'll see another move here as they slide around. And actually, it's, as you watch it, the upper and lower layers are also independent. So we have multiple layers going forward to back, and we can pause there. Multiple layers going forward to back, and then also low and high. So the low stuff was all on deck tracks being slid by deck winches, and then the upper stuff was all on traveler tracks being slid around by traveler winches. And you think about the number of stagehands that you would need to execute that move, because I think I got 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like eight to 10 moving pieces in that scene, all in on that show. There was over 20 different moving elements. And so the size of the stage crew, and then just that being able to hit those marks with a giant heavy piece of scenery and just adjust ever so slightly and get that beautiful slick motion at the end. This next one's another one actually from the Old Globe, which is, as we can see on screen, is just a large, heavy turntable. Well, I mean, it's a rotating house, and that skeleton of the house leaves little to no place for anyone to hide. If we're gonna, have stagehands trying to push this thing around, there's not really any place for them to be hidden. So instead, here again is a great use of automation, being able to move something big like that and heavy, and it's just an impressive scene change to watch that thing operate.
Are you always involved in sort of the rehearsals and the checking of this kind of situation in the first installation and iteration?
It depends greatly. So places like the Old Globe, almost never. They have a very competent technical staff, and they are customers that use our equipment, but they are, early on, we did a lot of support with them, kind of training them up on the system, but then they've been using it for the next decade without much intervention from us, except for when except when something of ours breaks and we have to help them out. And then this last one is an elevator for a production of Mamma Mia at the Fifth Ave Theater up in Seattle. And similarly, this is just kind of a large load moving at a reasonable clip. So this is 18 inches a second, so about a half meter a second, and moving 4,000 pounds, so 2 tons. of weight. And that's again just an example of where doing that by hand would be tricky. Then that one maybe, it really only had a couple of positions, so potentially you could do that more as a mechanized move, but then you'd lose out on some of the elegance of that motion where it decelerates down and stops smoothly if you're just running it on buttons. But again, things that you just wouldn't really be possible to do effectively, either for the quality of the motion or just for the sheer volume of people you would need backstage hauling on ropes to get this thing to go, right?
Exactly. Giselle asks, is the Hamilton stage automated? I don't know if you're aware of how the Hamilton stuff is set up. Is that got automation in it?
Yep. It sure does. I mean, the big thing there being those donut turntables are automated. So one of the guys who actually works for us now previously worked on some of the design work for the Hamilton, the original Broadway, and then some of the first out of town shows as well. Yeah, it's automated. Yeah, and what's great about seeing a show like that, where it's like so wildly popular and has a great automated element to it, is that it really starts to trickle down through all these other productions too. We see a lot more demand for those donut turntables where you've got a ring that's revolving, and then you have a center that can counter rotate as well, and they're independently controlled.
Yeah, cool.
And then the next thing I think is where it really starts to get interesting, and I'm titling this "Elegant Robots." So where we get to really choreograph the motion, where these are like ballet dancers made out of metal and computer chips, and that the motion is maybe not necessarily something that's so big and heavy or fast that we couldn't do it by hand, but just trying to get that choreography worked out would require a lot more time and effort to do it another way. And here the computers, again, can really help us, because not only is it easier to program than it is to rehearse, but also every time we want to make a slight adjustment, it's like you watch the motion, you're like, if it was just like a half second quicker, or if it was, go a little bit further, that's just a couple of keystrokes away. And so it's not a big deal for the artist to kind of iterate on their vision, and that every time they want to make a little adjustment to get closer to what's in their brain, it's easy for us to facilitate that, because the computers are very fast at that sort of editing and changing, and we're not teaching anything. We don't have to rehearse a different move. It's just a couple of keystrokes, and how's that look, and away we go. I would say also that a great use of automation in these scenarios is the pre-production work, where not only is it easy to edit at the tech table, but hopefully you've had some time prior to that to sit down and do your pre-visualization on the computer and watch the animations of the motions and see, get those things as tight as you can. And there, of course, are going to have to be changes once you see it in the flesh, but we can get that much closer to being show ready, so that by the time we hit the tech table, we're a lot closer, and it takes a lot less of everybody's time. So
I think that's one of the major advantages of automation, is being able to pre-visualize that and plan those scene changes, and exactly how much time you've got. And right. As you know, time in the theater is money, right? So any time that you can save in that pre-preparation makes it just allows time to free up for other things, whether it be artist staging or something else, rather than sitting there teching it for hours on end, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And it's a thing that we love to do whenever we are able to be involved in the production process, of sitting down prior and talking with stage management and trying to work out those cues. And even if you don't have those final positions absolutely nailed, like you just rough everything in as much as you can. And then in your first shot that you get that valuable stage time that you can just run through with your automation operator and like, all right, we're going to hit the bedroom scene. We're going to hit the street scene. We're going to hit the parlor, whatever. Let's bring the wagons out, check our spikes, make some quick adjustments, and next, right? And if you can just bang through a list of like, we've got to nail positions on these 20 different looks, that's so much easier than we're going to start building the entire automation queue or building the whole scene change with everybody standing there staring at you, wondering why it's not ready yet. So yeah, anything that you can do to get ahead of that is well worth it.
Cool. Shall we look at this video?
Yeah, let's look at this video. So this first one is actually from a production of Christmas Carol. This was up at Theater Calgary before the world stopped. And this is, I think, a really beautiful set. And it's multiple layers of tracks and big dimensional scenery that has to be able to track and spin at the same time. Things that track and spin we usually call turtles, and we called these sky turtles because they were up in the air. And there you can see the panels whisking away as Scrooge's bed is lowering down, and this will just be a slow-mo version of that same move. And I think that's just it's a great whooshing move, right? At that brick wall at the beginning that slides out of the way. And we can pause here. Mm-hmm. So the brick wall at the beginning slides out of the way. And then as the wagon comes down stage, we close in and shutter in with those masking walls. And it's not flashy, right? It's not a big musical move. It's just a straight play. It's a small box set. But what a great transition, right? And you don't have to like drop the main rag and move some stuff around. Like the audience stays engaged. We don't break that whatever that emotion is that they're having right then. They continue it, and the story just transitions to the next look, which I think is great. Yeah. And then
it's super clean.
Isn't that clean? I love that style of automation where it's
subtle.
It's very subtle, right? And I think if you're not paying close attention and you're just engaged in the show, it kind of goes by without you even noticing it, right? Which is how, as technical people, we know when we're doing a good job, when you don't notice the technology.
Yeah, because you don't necessarily want to make the technical elements the spectacle, because you're trying to serve a story at the end of the day. And I think that's sometimes, especially in the world that I've worked in the circus realm, you have the tendency to use automation for automation's sake. But You've got to ask yourself, is it necessary, and does it serve what we're trying to do artistically? And I think that's it's a dance to play, and it's important. I really like when you have that moment where you're using it for artistic sake, not for the sake of using technology. So
right, and it's fun sometimes too, just to play around with the technology because it's big and brash. But I love those quiet moments in the stage where it really supports the story.
Yeah.
And so if we want to roll back a little bit, we'll get to
I'll go back a bit more. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah. So this is, so we finish up there. And then this is South Coast Repertory Theater in Los Angeles again. And so we have a tracking element of the house, and it's on a turtle. So it's going to start rotating here as the rest of the house comes out. And it's just going to meet up very nicely and cleanly and make that transition. And I think
this one. Sorry, just to understand the turtle. So it's on a track, but then within the track, that system's able to rotate. Is that the sense of what a turtle does? Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can pause that one.
I want to go back and watch that again, by the way, because it just looks so cool.
It's such a great move, right? It's really pretty. And I think, this one is maybe a little bit of automation for automation's sake, but I don't think it's overpowering. Yeah. And I think, again, it's, the other option would be we got to get from outside to inside. We'd have to either dim the lights or bring in the main rag. And here, again, you just get to stay in the moment, and the set transforms very elegantly in front of you, which I think is another just great use of an artistic scene change. And that's a thing where these theaters that we're showing here, like the Geffen Playhouse and the Old Globe and South Coast Rep, they have, these aren't like custom. I mean, obviously the scenery is very custom and beautifully done, but those automation components are really Lego pieces. Like they have a cache of, deck tracks and turtles and these reusable chunks that can, without, not that I want to get sidetracked on the economics of it, but without having to do a huge expenditure for each production, it's like, well, we've got these things. So we can make something that slides and twists, and we can make something that flies. So if the set designer knows that coming into it, like that these things are available and aren't terribly costly to your budget, but we can get some pretty good bang for the buck which I think is great to have when you in that kind of repertory situation where you just have a stockpile, much like you'd have, in a lighting inventory. You'd have some movers and you'd have some whatever the hell lighting people do. I don't know. So whatever it is, it takes a lot of money. I know that.
Yeah, exactly.
But you'd have this tool palette that the lighting designers would know they'd have to they'd have this inventory that they could use in their design. And similarly with automation, once a theater has those things kind of in stock, then the scenic designer knows that they have them at their ready.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the last one on this video? I'll just go back to it.
So this is again a kinetic sculpture, and this was it was a sculpture that was meant to draw attention to the rising tides and climate change. And these lifts are that structure on top is meant to look like a building, and they're coming in and out of water. So this whole thing in its final installation was surrounded by water. And the lifts weren't actually in water, so they were, like a pool that ran up to the edges of these lifts.
Right.
But the point of the motion here was that this was supposed to be like the elements, the movement rather of a lunar clock. And so, the tides are linked to the movement of the moon. And so that is, if you watch those movements throughout like a whole day, you will see it cycle in time with the actual tides. And this was installed on a beach. So it was a really interesting artistic vision. And there, I think, is just a great example of using automation for something that I think is untenable otherwise, right? Because one of those lifts is cycling, once every 12 hours, and then the other ones are cycling at various periods. And so at the right time, they will all cycle back up and match up, but then they start their transitions again, where this one's going like this and this one's going like that. I can't even do it with my hands, but it would be wildly difficult to do manually.
And laborious, not to mention laborious.
Right. And with a computer, right, you just you're like, okay, I want this one to go, this many times up and down, and I want it to take 8 hours. And I want this one to go up and down one time, and I want it to take 8 hours. And that's as simple as the cue writing is, right?
Yeah.
It's like you just kind of describe the motion, and the computer's like, cool, I wasn't doing anything for the rest of the day anyway. Like, I'm gonna just sit here and run these. I'm gonna run these lifts. Like,
I got
what I was made for.
And this last one?
And this last one is actually from a TV show. So this was Sing China, which is kind of like a similar singing competition to The Voice. Yeah. And that one, you can see that the chairs are like sliding down a ramp, and the judges, this is for their blind audition, the judges are behind a panel, so they can't see the contestant. As soon as they hear a voice they want, they slap their button, and then that masking panel's got to shoot up, and they've got to shoot down the stage on that high-speed ramp. And so you've got a couple of interesting things there that are really demanding some automation. I mean, number one is like it's got to be safe, right? Like you can't Wile E. Coyote the judge into the panel. We got to make sure that panel. You cannot do that.
I have to play it again because I need to see it now that you've described it to me. But yeah.
And you can't have the that shutter come down on top of a judge's head.
Yep.
So those safety concerns are very real, right? And we want to be very cognizant of them. But then the other interesting dynamic there is, unlike a typical theater show, although actually we see this sometimes in theater shows too, but that's all performer driven, right? You can't have an automation operator that's going to sit backstage and be like, oh, I think he pushed the button, I'll go ahead and run him down now. Like those mushroom buttons on the judges' chairs are tied directly back to the automation computer. And when they see that signal, if it's safe to move, you're going to go. And where we were talking about every night it's got to be repeatable, this is kind of the opposite. Like that little chunk, that subroutine of motion has to be repeatable. We got to make sure that we don't face plant the judge, and we got to make sure we don't crush him. But Otherwise, we have no idea what the timing is. And in fact, the timing has to be critically obeyed, right? Because this is like the judges rushing to get, that's part of the fun of the event is like, everyone's trying to slap their buttons and get down the stage. And similarly, the judges are not automation operators. So they might just sit there and whack their buttons, dozens of times in excitement. And that can't re-trigger the motion. So there's a little bit of fancy programming there from an automation operator to make sure that, we're going to watch that input and then we're going to kill that input after we see it go live until an appropriate time so that we can't have a misfire. So there'll be like an arming of those buttons. And then we're going to run those as well. And I think that's a great example of a kind of non-traditional use of scenic automation, but that's a totally scenic automation job. Like that, you're not going to call a canning factory to make the judges' chairs for a singing competition. Like that's a place where theatrical automation is called for, and we know how that's supposed to work, and we know the environment that it's going to be used in and the critical parts of it.
That's what's always interesting, because when you think about the automation for particularly entertainment aspects of it, it's really important that whoever's manufacturing that aspect of it understands the context in which that's going to be used, right? So that your arts degree or your training leans you to understanding that industry, so therefore you're serving that properly, as opposed to just somebody going, well, I can make a machine that does that, but there's a narrative and there's a story and there's a purpose and there's an interactivity with live entertainment that is quite niche, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
And as a side note, too, I was just maybe a month ago down in New York doing another kinetic art installation, and where we see a lot of crossover there, too, right? Because it's an artistic endeavor, but it requires mechanism and electronics and so on. So it's like we're well poised, and scenic automation people are well poised to help visual artists with their kinetic sculptures as well. Yeah. And we ourselves internally spent a long time convincing the client that that we were not happy with the quality of the motion that we were seeing. And I mean, it's a thing that we had made, right? But as we're demonstrating it, they're like, "Yeah, I think this is fine. I think we're ready to ship." And I'm like, "Wait, it's not ready to ship. You are not going to be satisfied with what we're seeing as the quality of this motion, right? Like it's just not quite smooth enough and pretty enough for what it should be." And ultimately, like, it's a weird position to be in. We're like, I mean, it's like all on us. We got to pay for it. We got to do all these things, but we just need a couple more days because it's got to be better than it looks right now. And again, I think coming out of a world where the visual quality of the motion is something that we put a lot more value on than any industrial automation company is ever going to do, right? It's just not, as long as it hits the kind of marks and it does the thing, what does it matter? It's like, well, it matters because like the whole point of this is visual enjoyment. And if you look at this and it doesn't make you, it doesn't satisfy that, then it's not doing its job. And that gets kind of like squishy arty, but that's the job. But
it's an important facet for sure. Before we go on to the next one, Giselle asks, do automated moving sets always need tracks on the floor to follow? So I guess if I was to say, not necessarily, because it could be rigged from the ceiling and the scenic pieces come in from the ceiling, right? But can you respond to that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, your first answer is a great one, right? That a lot of times we prefer it to always be guided in some way. So if we can get a track in the floor, that's great. If we can't get a track in the floor, we'd love to have a track overhead. And then when those things can't be tolerated, there are options for having basically, kind of rudderless scenic automation. There's a couple of companies in Europe that actually make roving platforms that as a product. There are other companies that will do it, bespoke roving platforms as well. And very early on in my career, I worked on a project that also required a totally trackless wagon that could, position itself around the stage. And I had nothing to do with the actual engineering.
A miracle piece.
Yeah, it was just that I was an innocent bystander, like putting in the dumb winch decks when the much more talented engineers were designing this thing, and they were using radio receivers around the room to be able to triangulate the position of the piece and then adjust its position on stage accordingly. So it is possible. I would say that those things are always more difficult, more error prone, and more expensive. So if the straightest path, no pun intended, is just to get a track, and it could be a curvy track. It could have even like little switchbacks and things. We've done things like that where kind of like railroads, where you can flip over from one track to another to have different kinds of curves throughout the show. But if at all possible, it's great to have it either tracked below or from above. And then when that can't be done, yeah, there's other options. They're just they're phenomenally trickier.
And is there a tendency to do sort of more floor tracks for theatrical installations? Because I would imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, but if you're touring a show, you may not always have the weight loading in the ceiling to be able to take the infrastructure that you might need to guide stuff above the stage. So you can always build a stage with a track in it, right, on top of the actual stage.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Absolutely. I think that is the preference typically in touring shows. And like you said, and that way also you're just bringing the whole shebang with you. So like you're laying your show deck down on top of the permanent stage floor, and all of your automation is in the deck, which is definitely a preference and an easier way to go, for all the reasons you outlined. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so our last section is what?
So this is, I call it plays wells with others. So this is like the ratcheting up the integration of automation to mostly projection, but also lighting. So we'll have a few different things that we can probably let play through here. The first one is just a shop test where we're showing a little guy walking on in a GIF, but we're going to pin that animation to a moving set piece. And as the set piece moves across, the guy is going to stay framed on the set piece and move with it. And this is not done with any trickery. We're not like cueing the video projection to move in a certain amount of time and then just matching that timing with the automation. Here we're taking the actual position that we know from the automation console and feeding it to the video projection system, and taking that data and using it as a transform to shift the image around. And so when we do this, generally speaking, we make the projected image is basically the size of the stage or the extreme boundaries of however far we want it to go. And then we have a little square of whatever the thing is we're projecting, and then we just shift it around within that image. So if you think of the stage as being like your computer monitor, that's the proscenium, and then we can dance that image, that little box of whatever we want to show, anywhere in that range. So we can go ahead and play this first one, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And then we just get kind of progressively trickier from there. So this is just a little dude walking, and then as we run the very small little deck track here, he just stays on the image. And like I said, you could take this by hand, like on the dials, and run it back and forth, and that image is going to stay with it the whole time because it's really pinned to it. And here's we can go ahead and play it. The Austrian, this is again kind of an understated look where the Austrian is going up, and we're taking that scalloped edge and using that to mask the video. Here again, another video screen just going out, but that's all front projection, not bleeding onto the proscenium. All mapped, pinned to it. And as the set piece comes down, actually some of those lighting cues are just being triggered by the position. Last one, or one of the last ones here, these are some large periactoi. This is for a Adobe show, and this is all front projection, but they're mapping onto those that prism and keeping the images pinned as they want it as the thing rotates. So doing a whole bunch of transforms to keep the image locked onto that set. And then here's a curved wall counter rotating around a car platform. This is for a Cadillac reveal. But you can see like that image is not bleeding onto any of the rest of the set. It's all like locked onto that set piece. And as that set piece rotates around, the image is is translating with it or rotating and skewing with it. And any of those images where we're seeing some flat plane that's starting to twist, you've got not only like just keeping it on here, but then as it twists, skewing the image so that it keystones correctly to stay mapped on there. And I think that those kinds of uses are really cool. It's a really neat effect. And again, it's like one of those things that if you're just caught in the moment of the kind of flashiness, you don't quite recognize how much math is going on behind the scenes to take that data, from the motors, spit it out over the network, shoot it into a video projection system, and then have that do a bunch of transformations on the video and stick it onto the moving piece. But I think that that's a really cool creative use. And some of those are, it's especially huge, obviously, in the commercial world, right? Anytime we're doing big flashy corporate events and things like that, those effects tend to be really well loved. But the some of the first uses we had of that sort of thing were actually just for traditional theater shows, like the La Jolla Playhouse out in Los Angeles did a production of Yoshimi Loves Pink Robots. What's it? The Flaming Lips musical.
Okay. Don't know if maybe somebody in the audience might know.
But it was a situation where, and this going back to like 2010-ish. And for us, we hadn't really delved into this realm at all of making the systems talk to each other. But we had a technical director out there who'd been using our equipment for the better part of a decade, and they had a request from the scenic designer that like, hey, we really want to try projection mapping where, these things are going to move around, but I've got all these video images that need to stay on the set pieces. And the projection designer said, yeah, well, we'll fit a bunch of sensors onto the scenery and we'll feed that back into the projection system. And the technical director was very savvy. And he's like, we already have sensors on all of these pieces because we have to use it for the automation system to be able to control its position. So let's just talk to the manufacturer and see if there's some way we can't get that data out of the automation system and hand it over to the projection system. And that was our first use case of doing it. And we're like, well, yeah, we're not projection guys, but that sounds totally reasonable. Yes, we have all that data. Yes, we're on a network. Let's dig into like how that would work. And at that time, we were doing mostly, they were doing all Datathon watch out. And so that was our first foray into it. But these days there's, and we'll talk more about this next week, but POSI StageNet is a very popular protocol. So PSN, that's kind of a generic standard that many of these systems are now adapting.
That's what Aaron's question was. What protocols do your systems support for communication with those systems? So yeah. So what is it called again?
POSI StageNet or PSN.
Right.
And so there's 3 different ones that we support. So Datathon Watchout has its own proprietary one that we support. POSI StageNet is the more generic one that we support as well for Disguise and others. Isadora, I think, also uses that. They might actually just use OSC. So that's the third thing we do is we also support OSC output. So we will stream OSC open sound protocol, open sound control messages out over the network that just give little messages about where the motor is. And so you can also use that even in like QLab, for instance, which is a very popular, affordable show control system that will do has projection features now too. And so you can tie OSC messages from SpikeMark into things like that. So,
amazing. Chris says Yoshimi battles the pink robots. That's the name of the
thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. And Elliot says that Turek Cirque du Soleil does projection with automation moves. I haven't seen that myself, but I know that Cirque does a lot of that kind of technology in their shows where they can and have the ability to. So that's super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just becoming more and more commonplace for sure. But I think what's really fun about those is that it's now coming, it's down market enough that you can do it in almost any size production now. Like your high school musical, if they were so inspired, could certainly get their hands on the equipment to do that and make it happen. And a lot of these softwares, I know ours as well as others, have like free versions that have all those features enabled, so that you can like for previs and stuff, you can even set up your previs automation and test out sending the network messages over to like your video server and stuff, and see all that stuff work, which is just kind of super
it's amazing.
Cool, easy things.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working with some previs stuff recently, and just the ability to do a lot of that pre-production with SFX and lighting and stage moves, automation stage moves, all in one thing. And even if it isn't necessarily that you can actually plug that data into the automation system, but at least you know exact timings and that sort of thing that goes with the rest of it. That data can be extracted and then put in the system. So I just think that's, you know, especially now when we're talking about the way that theatrical projects are evolving, and now they're more hybrid because of post-COVID and everything. Like, there's shorter time frames, they've got smaller budgets, so anything you can do out of the theatre where time is money and people and staff, the better. So I just think it's such a great space to be in, and quite exciting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like you said, and it's way more efficient, just for all those reasons that you said, that, you know, you're not having the orchestra here waiting for you to finish doing your automation queue, which is usually where people get the most upset. It's like, you know how much musicians cost, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the last one, I think, and we've hit the hour already, Gareth. So I think we did a great job covering that in just an hour. So amazing. If there's anybody that's got any other questions, please ask them now, or we're going to sign off in just a few minutes. But next week, do you just want to give a little bit of a brief about what you're going to talk about next week in specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, again, today we kind of covered the why would you bother doing this, and next week what I really want to dig into is some of the how, and it'll be a similar kind of short format thing, so it won't be super in depth, but we want to just walk through making up for a lot of the you don't have to spend nearly so much time like every night, but that means that you do have to do a little bit more planning beforehand to make effective use of it and not get yourself in a pickle. So I want to touch on that, kind of the architecture of an automation system, and then what are the things you want to make sure you put on your calendar if you're going to do an automation show, and what sort of timings does that require?
Amazing. Well, we look forward to that next week. Thank you so much for that, Gareth, especially because I know you've been your company's loading a lot of trucks today and in the middle of a big load, so I appreciate your time.
Yeah. No, yeah, it was great. It was a lot of fun, and we're just really happy to be busy. So, but it's I love these talks, and it's great to get a chance to do it.
Wonderful. All right, then. Well, Gareth, we'll see you next week, and thank you everyone for joining us online. I hope you'll join us next week as we go into a little bit more depth about the depth and breadth of automation with Gareth. Talk to you soon.
Great.